My name is Enherid Lang. I am the Executive Director of PHAP, that's short for the International Association of Professionals in Humanitarian Assistance and Protection. Very pleased to be able to welcome everyone here to this webinar. And as we have people joining from all over the world, a good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're logging in from today. This webinar, entitled Balancing Risk Appetite and Risk Tolerance in Humanitarian Operations, is organized by ICVA and PHAP. It's the second event in the new learning stream of ICVA on risk management in practice. I'm joined today by my co-host, Jeremy Rempel, Head of Humanitarian Finance at ICVA.
Greetings, Ingrid, and pleasure to be with you here on another webinar.
Great, and a pleasure to be co-hosting with you once again, Jeremy. So with that, we will turn to today's event. In today's session, we will be looking at two key concepts in risk management in general, but that do take on particular significance in humanitarian operations due to the types of environments and situations where humanitarian action is carried out. These two concepts are, on the one hand, risk appetite, and on the other hand, risk tolerance. We'll be discussing these concepts as well as how they relate to risk management in general and to issues related to risk transfer in particular. Now, before handing over to Jeremy to introduce us to these concepts, I'd like to welcome our panelists for today's session who will be sharing their experiences of dealing with these concepts in their own organizations. First, Robert Nelson, joining us from the west coast of the United States, so quite early for you over there, Robert, is the Director on Enterprise Risk Management and Compliance with World Vision International. He's been working since 2007 on the organization's ERM program, as well as the development of an integrated incident management system, blocked third-party screening system, whistleblower hotline, and more recently, a global compliance function. Connecting today from Geneva is Oscar Keeble, who's Senior Enterprise Risk Management Officer with the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, where he's focusing on strengthening the risk culture through improving the organization's risk management processes, systems, and policies. He also supports the management of UNHCR strategic risks and is a member of the UN system-wide cross-functional risk management task force. Warm welcome to both of you, Robert and Oscar. Great to have you with us.
Thank you for having me. I look forward to the discussion today.
Likewise. Hello, everyone.
Terrific. Okay, so as we get started now with you, Jeremy, we've had a request from one of our participants, that's Sarah in Italy, that we start out by specifying what we mean with risk and risk management, as we know that participants joining today have very different levels of familiarity with these essential concepts. So let's start with that. Jeremy, how do we define risk and risk management? Over to you.
Great, thanks, Ingrid. I think a good question to start out the conversation, as I'll share in a little bit. We're some ways into our series on risk, but I think always good to make sure we start with some common framework for how we're defining terms. So these two terms in particular are important to have some common understanding of. So generally in our work, at least through ICVA, we're using the standard definitions for these terms that are coming as much as possible from the ISO 31000 framework for risk. So you'll see on the screen some text for the two definitions. I think one around risk, important to recognize that it's the effective uncertainty on an organization's objectives. Something interesting to note there, it doesn't suggest that risk is only negative. In practice, we tend to look at the negative impacts of risk when we're talking about risk management, but the actual ISO definition is looking more at uncertainty more broadly on an organization's objectives. And then I think second, risk management, you'll see there the coordinated activities to direct and control an organization with regard to risk. So it's the intentional process that we go through, the set of tools that we have, the guidelines, policies, controls are important to consider that we use to direct and control an organization's reaction to risk. So that's the piece that we look at with risk management. So the topics that we have today around risk appetite, risk tolerance, and how we work with them should largely fit within this definition of risk management, looking at how we address risk in an organization. But good question to go through some of the basic definitions.
Great. And following up then, why is risk management important for humanitarians to have a grasp of? Why is it a priority topic for ICVA? Back to you, Jeremy.
Yeah, great. I think this is where it's helpful to look through again a little bit of the background and how we frame the issue of risk and how we're looking at it. I think you can see some on the screen there, a few brief different ways in which we define the humanitarian space. I think all of us should be familiar with the ICRC Code of Conduct, but we also have SPHERE. We have the humanitarian principles set up. I think it should be clear to all of us working in the humanitarian space that our work is in fact inherently high risk. We're working in the most difficult locations with some of the most vulnerable populations. It's part of the humanitarian imperative. So risk is a significant factor in our everyday lives as humanitarians and the work that we do. And so this willingness to accept risk and work in high-risk places, I think, is part of the core identity of humanitarians. So it's critical that we address these issues of risk and risk tolerance. If for any reason it's a core part of the work that we do in the humanitarian space. So important to understand how we not eliminate risk, but how we manage it appropriately, how we recognize that it exists, how we work within the reality of our context as humanitarians. And I think questions of risk and risk management are core to that work. Maybe briefly to go a little bit farther here, you see, I think this has come up in conversation as well, important to recognize that we're not just doing risk management for others, right? I think when we consider the more technical side of risk management, frequently we think of it as perhaps a due diligence process, perhaps an obligation that we have to fulfill to meet the expectation of a donor. However, I do like to emphasize that when we're doing risk management well, good risk management is a basic element of a well-functioning organization to support good decision-making, to operate more effectively. It's not something that we do for others. So when we're managing risk better, we should be more effective at serving the needs of people. So when we're operating in humanitarian context, working with people in the greatest need, our ultimate goal with doing risk management well is to be better at serving the needs of those people, not necessarily just looking upwards in a chain of funding or just to donor requirements. So important to keep in mind that there's a key internal element of the need to do good risk management. And briefly as well to touch on where we are in this risk management series. We heard early on that this is part of an ongoing series of risk management done by ICVA. We had, as you'll see on the screen, an early webinar last year. We covered some of the basics of risk management and organizational culture, fed into our annual conference back in March 2020. We had a webinar earlier in the summer on security risk management, and we have our discussion now on risk appetite and tolerance gap. So good to recognize that our discussion today fits into a series, an ongoing series on risk management. You can go back and listen in to those recordings of the previous events if you want to. That gives you an idea of where we're fitting into the event today. And maybe quickly as well, just to go through the purpose. I think this fits in, aligns well with the question on why we do risk management. The purpose of the series, I think we're trying to make risk management more accessible to both practitioners and decision makers. This is not a new area. There's lots of materials that exist in the world of risk management. I think particularly in the private sector, you can find a multitude of resources that help understand risk management, provide examples of tools, etc. But we're not always well versed at translating those into issues in the humanitarian space. So trying to do a better job of examining core risk management issues that are unique to the humanitarian space, but then also ensure that the existing tools and lessons are translated well into that space. And then as well, we're not the only ones working on issues of risk management. I think later in the presentation today, we'll talk about some action that is going on with other groups in the humanitarian space. So part of the objective too, we want to avoid duplication and make sure we complement the efforts of others as well.
Great. Thanks so much, Jeremy. And yes, those resources that Jeremy mentioned, in particular the recordings of previous sessions, those are available online. My colleagues Jane and Nishani are posting those links in the chat now. We'll also include those links in the follow-up email to this event so that you can have access to those easily. Before we move on, I just want to briefly point out, just to underscore some of what Jeremy was saying there, I can see from the responses to the poll that it really is an important and very active, I'm sure, discussion for those of you who are joining today, the webinar. It's less than half of today's participants feel that risk management is currently fully integrated in the way they're working in their organizations, and there's work to do. A significant percentage responding that risk management is well integrated at HQ, but less so in operational context. So a very active discussion indeed, and I think a well-timed learning stream. So very glad that you're all able to join us for this. Now, turning over to specifically today's topic as a part of this overall learning stream, we're going back to you, Jeremy, so that you can help us with defining the key, specific key concepts that we're addressing today. So again, risk appetite and risk tolerance. Back to you, Jeremy.
Great, thanks, Ingrid. Yes, to move on in the definition stream. So a couple of additional key definitions: risk appetite and risk tolerance. You'll see both of those on the screen. It'll be interesting as we get into the panelists' presentations as well to hear if there's any differences here. I think sometimes you can have slight differences in how people see these definitions implemented in practice. Risk appetite is a little more of a standardized definition around the amount and type of risk an organization is prepared to pursue or take. Again, that's the more technical definition coming from ISO. Effectively, risk appetite is the willingness to take on risk. So you would expect this to vary some between organizations, particularly humanitarian NGOs, as I mentioned earlier, working in areas where we inherently have very high levels of risk. Safe to assume as humanitarians, generally, we have a fairly high risk appetite, certainly in our field-facing work, due to that willingness in part to work in areas that are naturally high risk in nature. So risk appetite, again, is the willingness to take on risk. Risk tolerance is a little different. So risk tolerance, if appetite is the willingness, tolerance, you'll see a technical definition there: an organization's readiness to bear risk after treatments in order to achieve its objectives. So it's a little bit of a more technical definition, but as opposed to willingness, I prefer to look at tolerance as the ability to take on risk. So if appetite is the willingness to take on risk, tolerance can be distinguished in definition as the ability to do so. I might note that risk tolerance can be a little different organization to organization in how we define and look at risk tolerance. Frequently, risk tolerance can look more specifically down at some of the detailed components of individual risks that might be mapped out in an organization, where appetite might be set at a higher level. But I think critical to understand that difference of appetite being a willingness versus tolerance being a more technical ability to handle risk. And I think we'll come back to some of that distinction as we go forward in the conversation as well today. Another piece, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, you can go right ahead, Jeremy. That's fine.
I was getting into my flow here. So maybe quickly to go over this second piece of risk tolerance, risk appetite. I think something that helps frame the thinking in general and the purpose of our discussion today is to understand something of this risk appetite tolerance gap. And this is a piece of thinking that ICVA has been engaged in quite a bit over the last year, is how we look at issues of tolerance and appetite. So the difference between willingness to handle risk and ability to do so, and the implications if there's a mismatch there. So you can see in the slide on the screen, part of the hypothesis I think that we have when it comes to some of the issues we have in the humanitarian system with risk appetite tolerance is the potential gap between the two. I think in the current landscape, an issue that you frequently see is on the donor side. We have a risk appetite that is frequently much lower than the tolerance. So willingness to manage risk somewhat lower than the ability to do so. On the NGO or partner side, the opposite situation, whereas field-facing NGOs in particular, we frequently have a very high level of risk appetite, whereas the tolerance or our ability to manage that risk might not in all cases be matching that appetite. So an appetite that's higher than the tolerance to do so. And you have some effects effects that come out of that gap. So some characteristics on the donor side, lower levels of risk overall, zero tolerance language risk, that we'll come back to that point in a little bit. But overall, the ability to manage risk possibly greater than the willingness to do so. On the partner or NGO side, higher levels of risk overall, field-facing, risk-hungry. Frequently, the risk appetite might be poorly defined. I think that's something we'll touch upon today as well, and appetite above tolerance. So we have this situation. I think the end result that we're concerned of is, even if we have zero tolerance language floating around, that can be on paper only. If there's a clear gap at the field where appetite has expanded beyond tolerance, effectively we have a situation where the management of risk is at best ineffective, at worst might not really be existent. And as I pointed out earlier, we're not really in a great potential to meet the needs of people in crisis, certainly not to the extent that we would like to. And that's not in anyone's interest. So I think that comes down to the fundamental issue. If we're operating with a significant gap between appetite and tolerance, particularly where appetite is outstripping our tolerance, so willingness to handle risk is beyond our capability to do so, it's not really in the interest of donors, partners, or the people in crisis that whose needs we're trying to meet, to be in that situation. So it's part of the issue that we want to resolve in our exploration of the risk management topic. I should maybe point out quickly too, before I go back to you and Herod, UN agencies can float somewhere between donor and partner. I didn't specifically put UN here on the screen, in part because they can act both as a donor and as a partner, depending on the situation. Money is flowing through from donor states to partners. So UN in some ways can face both of these issues on both ends as well. But let me pause it there and go back to you, Herod.
Okay, great. Thanks, Jeremy. And very useful to frame the problem in this way. I think it's helpful to pair the terms with these visuals. It helps a lot, especially in a context where not everyone is consistent with using, for example, tolerance in the same way in the context of risk. So very helpful indeed. Thanks so much, Jeremy. We have a quick question from Shah in Bangladesh. I think it would be useful to address now before we move on to our panelists, as we're speaking about definitions. Shah is wondering if you could clarify the difference between risk tolerance and risk management. Back to you, Jeremy.
Sure, I think that's an easy, brief one. Hopefully clarified a little bit in some of the definitions I shared earlier. But risk tolerance would be a subset of the broader approach to risk management. So if risk management is effectively the whole body of tools, guidelines, approaches, et cetera, that we use to our internal controls, et cetera, that we use to address risk within an organization, risk tolerance would be that particular element within our set of guidelines, tools, et cetera, that helps us to identify in different risk categories our ability to manage specific risks for the organization. So risk tolerance, again, is a subset of the broader toolbox or a grouping of risk management tools where we're looking specifically at risks that have been mapped out for our organization and identifying our ability as an organization to manage those risks. So it's really one is a subset of the other.
Okay, great. And I see one more question that I think we should address now before we move on, while we're on specifically this framing. That's from Anton, who's asking in the chat, ideally, should tolerance always be bigger than appetite? What do you say, Jeremy?
Yeah, so that's a good question, and I think we might have some, I guess, some more comments on that as we hear the panelists speak. I think in an ideal scenario, right, your target would be to have some balance there. I would say if you're able to operate in a completely ideal scenario and balance the two entirely, that would be great. In reality, I think that rarely happens. So I'm not sure there's a scenario where you would always have tolerance above appetite if you're going to err one way or the other. That probably is the better way to go. My sense is more if you're engaging well in the process of risk management, you'll be wrestling with these two on an ongoing basis. So you might have more of a trade-off between the two over time, but I think the goal would be to, as part of your management process, at a minimum, be aware of what your tolerances are, what your appetite is, and have those clearly defined. And that then enables you in some way to adjust as appropriate over time, as there's shifts in context, shifts in ability to manage risk. I think probably not a scenario where things like tolerance will be constant across an entire organization over all of time. So I think part of the challenge is to define things well enough for your organization that you're able to have the appropriate level of awareness. You can adjust as appropriate and manage that gap over time. So probably more of a wrestling over time with these things. Then it's always going to be, your tolerance is always going to be above appetite. Ideal to have them balanced. If you're going to err one way or the other, maybe okay to have tolerance above appetite, but as you can see here, if that's too great of a gap, that's actually not a good thing as well. It can create you can have an inappropriate gap either way. So balance, I think, is really the key.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Jeremy. So with that, we'll move on from definitions, and I'd like to turn over to Oscar now, who will be sharing some of the experiences from his work with UNHCR on risk management. So Oscar, how has UNHCR approached the question of risk appetite and how to develop risk appetite statements? You have the floor.
Thanks very much, and good afternoon, good morning, everyone. I hope you can all hear me clearly. So I'm going to talk about two slightly different things here today. First is to give a little bit the story very briefly of UNHCR's risk journey, which is ongoing, and sort of where we are when it comes to risk appetite and what got us there. Then in the next part, I'm going to highlight a few points from a guidance document that I co-authored. This is at the UN level. There's an interagency group called the Risk Management Task Force, which I'm part of, and we produce reference models and guidance documents on risk management, aimed primarily at UN agencies, but I would say 90% of what we write applies equally to a humanitarian NGO. And there was a guidance document we produced there on developing risk appetite and how to go about it. And I'll highlight a few points from that And I believe the link to that document, which is publicly available, was in the background to this webinar. So first, when it comes to the risk management journey of UNHCR, as was mentioned earlier, as a humanitarian organization, risk is inherent in everything that we do. We cannot begin to try and fulfilling the humanitarian imperative without taking risks. Every time we open a new office, we engage in a new location, you have to embrace uncertainty and accept a certain level of risk. So throughout the history of the organization, we managed risks. But it wasn't until 2014 that we actually introduced a policy and a framework, an enterprise risk management policy, to try and do this in a more consistent way, a more consistent manner. But it was introduced, it was internally marketed as a light touch process. So we created risk registers in all our operations, we trained a number of staff, but we weren't really trying to achieve any significant cultural change or meaningfully change the way the organization worked. Then in 2017, two very bad risk events materialized in UNHCR. The first was a large-scale resettlement exploitation scheme in the Kakuma refugee camp in Kenya. And this was an exploitation scheme that involved some UNHCR staff members, where they, in coordination with a criminal network, were exploiting and extorting refugees for money in exchange for services that they were actually entitled to. And this was a particularly painful event because a similar scheme had happened in that same refugee camp just a few years beforehand. So this raised a number of serious questions amongst our donors, amongst our persons of concern, and our stakeholders more broadly, as to what were we doing to manage those risks that we should really have anticipated. The other big event that materialized and caused us as an organization a lot of pain was a series of control failures in our Uganda operation. That it was responding to an emergency, 2,000 people were crossing the border every day. We did fulfill the humanitarian imperative. We managed to make sure that all those people had water. But in the course of that, we had tens of millions of dollars of expenditure that wasn't governed by a contract, and that we couldn't verify exactly how much of that we actually received and how much of it was being invoiced incorrectly. So these two events together really shook the confidence of donors in us and also of our partners, the refugees and our other stakeholders. So in response to this, our High Commissioner announced a fresh or a new commitment to risk management. It was called Risk Management 2.0. And what that meant concretely was two main things. The first was we used to have two people in all of UNHCR responsible for risk management. We strengthened the central function, which I sit in, so it went from 2 people to 10. And we also created a network of dedicated senior risk advisors in our highest risk operations and also in our regional bureaus. So we went from 2 to about 30 people, in addition to all the focal points who do risk management on top of their existing role. And the other thing that we did as part of Risk Management 2.0 was to actually make a commitment to increasing the risk maturity of UNHCR, of developing a stronger risk culture and making sure that risk management was consistently embedded in everything that we do. And one of the big parts of that we're in the process of working on now is to develop a formalized set of risk appetite statements and a framework and a set of procedures to support that. But we are not there yet. Now, one question that often gets asked when we try and raise this topic internally is the kind of the pushback is, well, we always have had a risk appetite. We know what risks we want to take. It's natural. So why do we need to formalize it? And if you can see this picture, I like it because I think it really speaks to what risk appetite is. So that mouse that's eyeing the cheese while the cat is eyeing it, that mouse has a risk appetite. And its risk appetite is going to change based on the situation. If it's had a full meal, it's going to probably look at the situation and say, well, I don't fancy going for that cheese. On the other hand, if it's starving, it's going to be willing to take higher risks in pursuit of the cheese. It's objective. And if I can belabor this metaphor a little longer, I saw some questions in the chat about risk appetite and risk tolerance still, and another term you can use for risk tolerance is risk capacity. So, how much risk can you take? And in this picture, I guess the risk capacity of the mouse would be how fast it can run vis-a-vis the cat. So I'm not going to go through all these bullets here because I believe Robert's going to also talk about, why you would like to develop a risk appetite statement and framework. But maybe just to highlight 2 points, probably the main reason that we want to do it is that it introduces a consistency across the organization. And the second point is, we hopefully later on in this webinar will have the chance to discuss risk transfer or risk sharing a little bit more, whereby donors, UN agencies, and NGOs have a agreement about what risks they're willing to accept, and not just say we have a zero tolerance for fraud in delivering aid in a war zone, which, if you have a zero tolerance for delivering aid in a war zone, you don't deliver aid in a war zone. So we need to move beyond that. And I would say a precursor to having meaningful conversations about how we can share risk across the chain of donors, UN, NGO, is to have this articulation of risk appetite, but more on that later. Now, a few years ago, before I was in my current role, I was asked to lead an advisory on risk management in UNHCR. And one of the questions I was asked to answer was, and this was in 2016, should UNHCR introduce risk appetite? And my answer at the time was, not yet. UNHCR is not ready. And the reason for this is that introducing a risk appetite is not without its own risks. And if you do it badly, you can create more problems than you solve. So here we've got a picture of a very expensive golden tool that is sitting in a glass box, looking very pretty, but not being used. And my fear at the time was that if we roll out risk appetite now without certain preconditions being in place, that's what we're going to end up with. It's going to be expensive and time consuming. It's going to be process heavy, and it's not going to help anyone. If you do it badly, you can end up taking excessive risks, or what I think is more likely, you can become overly risk averse. Also, it can create confusion. If you set up metrics around risk appetite that aren't very well thought through, you can actually create perverse incentives for your managers, where things that see their performance rewarded are actually not helping you fulfill the humanitarian imperative. And, the last bullet there is that if you set up your risk appetite and you don't articulate it in a careful and clear way, donors may turn around and say, well, actually, our appetite is nowhere near yours, and therefore we're not willing to fund you anymore. So these are all risks to implementing risk appetite. And this is not to say that we shouldn't do it, and I very much think we do, and in UNHCR we're quite committed to doing it. But just to highlight that it's not without its dangers. So if we want, instead of having an expensive, golden, useless tool, if instead we want a spanner or a wrench that we can actually use in our work, what do we need to have in place? Well, and this is coming from the guidance note that I mentioned earlier, the interagency one. The first one is we need to be very clear on what our objectives are, because risks only exist in relation to our objectives. As humanitarian organizations, hopefully this is relatively straightforward for us, and we should be quite clear on what the objectives are, but nevertheless it is important to have that clarity. The second point is that you need a minimum level of awareness and knowledge amongst staff about risk management principles. You could argue that the best way to get this is actually by implementing risk appetite and rolling it out, but nevertheless, yeah, there needs to be this common knowledge so that when you talk about it, people know what you mean. It's not a huge amount of effort to get that, but in a very big organization, it can be challenging to make sure that message goes across. The next point is that you need to have proper governance in place around risk management. So there needs to be a senior body that is prepared to take decisions on what level of risk we want to take. For example, if we want to deliver core relief items in Syria, what proportion of that are we willing to be items that we go into a hard to reach area, we drop it on the floor and we leave? And that's a question that you have to ask and know the answer to. If it's 0, then you're not going to be able to deliver aid to a number of people who need it. If it's 100%, then maybe you're not going to get any funding because you're not going to be able to demonstrate to donors that anything we've delivered actually reached the intended beneficiary. So you need a governance body that is willing to take those kinds of decisions and say, is it 60%, is it 40%, or whatever metric you want to have. Linked to that, you need clear information to support these decisions. You also need the capacity to track and report on the actual level of risk. So there's no point saying that our risk appetite is 7 out of 10, however you define that, if you have no way of knowing where your actual real risk is. And then the last point is you need the ability or the capacity to respond. Say if you say, our risk appetite is 7 and right now it's 9, it's too risky, you need to be able to do something about it. Otherwise, that information in and of itself is not very helpful. So now just a few tips that came from that guidance document when it comes to introducing risk appetite. The first is to keep it practical and concrete. This has been a challenge that we've had when we've been trying to propose options for our senior management. So we wrote a first paper that was theoretical and then realized it wouldn't mean anything to them. So actually now while we're getting them to decide what approach they want to take to risk appetite, we're actually mocking up risk appetite statements. So to say, okay, if we go with this model, this is what it would look like. We would say, what is our risk appetite for delivering aid successfully versus the diversion of aid? What strategic objectives is that linked to? How will we measure it? How will we report on it? Who would set it, etc. So to keep it very practical and concrete. The second point is that it needs to be flexible and adaptable. The risk appetite that we have from one operation to another would vary. So, the risks that we would be willing to take in Jordan would be very different to the risks that we would be willing to take in Yemen, for example. And equally, over the life cycle of an emergency, the appetite will need to change as well. Things that are acceptable in the first couple of weeks of an emergency maybe aren't later on. And in the case of Uganda, this is what caught us out. So, we had 2,000 people crossing the border a day. They needed water yesterday. So our colleagues there did whatever it took to get the water to them as quickly as possible. So, we were delivering water without contracts, without proper procurements, without proper monitoring. And if you do that for a short while, that's okay. Part of the risks sharing discussion with donors is to say, well, we're willing to accept these kind of risks if it means that's the difference between getting water to people today or it taking another week. But at the same time, if that's okay for, a week or a month, it's not okay to do that for 18 months, which is what in the end happened with us. So that's another point. Then, you want obviously buy-in from senior management. If they're not committed to it, it's not going to work. You want it to be clear and measurable so they actually can concretely guide decision making. And as much as possible, you want it to be aligned with existing processes and part of the existing processes. If it is a brand new process that stands on its own, that is very likely to frustrate the colleagues in the field who are actually doing the humanitarian work and then are also having to fill out lots of additional forms to support your risk appetite process. And just a final thought to leave you with, which is that even if you're in a small local NGO or you're in an organization that doesn't yet have risk appetite in place as a formal process, you can still apply the principles of appetite and tolerance. You can still go through the thinking, ask yourself those questions about what risks am I willing to accept in certain circumstances and how can I manage them. And that will still be beneficial to you even in the absence of a formal policy. And with that, I will conclude. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Oscar. That was very, very helpful indeed and has generated a lot of questions. We have some terrific questions coming through, and I'd like to try and address, if we can, just a couple of those before we move on to Robert. So first of all, just pulling this from the chat, actually, there was a question from Ewan who wrote, so there's a very clear relationship between context and risk tolerance, but maybe the appetite stays more the same context to context. What would be your response to that, Oscar? Do you agree?
That's an interesting question, and it's one we're actually grappling with. So as we try and introduce risk appetite, one of the questions that we're posing to our senior management is who decides the risk appetite? And so one level will be, you say it's the High Commissioner who says this is the appetite for risk for the whole organization. And the other extreme of that would be to say that each country operation says this is our risk appetite. And we think we're probably going to go somewhere in the middle, which is that the regional bureau directors would set it for their countries. And I think you probably need different levels of appetite in different contexts, because to achieve the same results in different contexts, you need to take very different levels of risk. So, I mean, I gave the example of Jordan and Yemen. So in Jordan, at least in the UNHCR operation there, we've registered all the refugees. We have biometric information on them. If they want to get cash assistance, they go to an ATM with an iris scanner that reads their eyes, knows who they are, and then gives them the money that they're entitled to. So the risks that we would be willing to take in order to get aid to people in Jordan is actually very low. Whereas in Yemen, we don't have any of that. And if we want to get, life-saving aid to people, we need to take a lot more risk. So we will be willing to take a lot more risk in Yemen than we would in Jordan. I hope that answers the question.
Very good. Yes, thank you. We have another question from Ante connecting from Croatia, who writes, what is the level of formalization of risk appetite, and are you able to quantify risk appetite? Back to you, Oscar.
Okay, so at the moment, risk appetite in UNHCR is formalized sporadically in a few different places. So the place where it's perhaps best formalized in the UN is security. So UN agencies have a common security framework with something called program criticality, which I guess many of you will be familiar with. And it's a very clear, essentially a risk appetite framework that says program criticality level 1 is mass life-saving interventions. And for that, we're willing to accept a high level of security risk, and they have ways of defining that. And then you define your different levels of criticality from 2 down to 4, and the lower the criticality, the lower the level of risk. We've also got it defined in some extent in procurement, whereby procurement up to a certain value can be approved at the field. Above that, it has to go to headquarters. Then in emergencies, we raise that ceiling. So we're willing to essentially take more risk by allowing local managers to approve decisions of a higher dollar value. But what we haven't done is what we're working on now is to pull that all together into a single place. In terms of measuring, this is where it gets challenging and what we are struggling with. So if you think about the things that we want to take risks over, whether it's partnering with different organizations, whether it's supporting certain government agencies that have benefits but also potential risks involved in working with them, or whether it's in the delivery of aid, coming up with the metrics is a challenge. And this is what we are in the process of working on. I have a few ideas, but nothing concrete. And maybe I will let Robert talk about this as well, because I think World Vision are a bit more advanced than us in risk appetite for the time being.
Perfect. Thanks a lot, Oscar. So yes, now having heard from Oscar regarding UNHCR's experience in this area, I would like to turn now to Robert and ask, how does this relate to how World Vision International approaches risk appetite? You have the floor, Robert. Okay, so we're going to be reconnecting Rob. Sorry about that, just a bit of a challenge with the audio. We do have some additional questions for Oscar, so we'll maybe pose one more of those to you, Oscar, if you don't mind, and then hopefully we'll have Robert back on the line. We had this come in so from Chris, based in Switzerland, who wrote, without apparent risk appetite, and this was in response to your remarks, Oscar, without apparent risk appetite, how can you use risk management data to support decision making? Without a threshold, how do you know if you're taking too much or too little risk? It seems strange to set up a risk assessment process without an appetite. Did UNHCR's lack of risk appetite affect the organization's buy-in to the process? Over to you, Oscar.
That's a very good question and a very fair question. I would say two things in response to that. The first is that there's value in the risk assessment process outside of just, these decision makings in these real dilemmas about how much level of risk to take. So, what we found is that, even if you sit there in an operation and you go through the process of identifying your risks, you think through their causes, the events, the different consequences of them, and then you think through, okay, what can I do to prevent or detect these causes? Should the risk happen, what can I do to limit the negative impacts? On the flip side, if it's an opportunity, what can I do to make sure it happens, and what can I do to maximize the positive outcomes? So going through that process, this is without reference to any risk appetite, is very useful for helping you figure out what actions you need to take to maximize the likelihood and extent that you'll fulfill the humanitarian imperative, that you'll reach your objectives. it is a fair critique to say that unless you have a clear articulation of the level of risk you're willing to take, it is hard to use that process to then support these tough decision-making dilemmas. And then what I would say to that is that, as I mentioned in the presentation, our management does have quite a good intuitive sense of its risk appetite. We still want to codify it and write it down so that we're more consistent in the way we take risks and more clear and are better able to communicate. But I think the organization intuitively has a decent understanding of the level of risk it's willing to take in certain circumstances. Ideally, we have the full risk appetite statement. At the time when we introduced ERM, I think we wanted to take small steps and not go for a big bang trying to have the most mature system we probably could. I think it's fair to say initially there was a fair amount of internal resistance to it. It was seen as something that was being pushed on us by donors, by auditors, and there were questions about the value it added. So I think in our organizational culture, it worked well for us to start slowly, to introduce the processes, and then to gradually become more advanced and sophisticated. But the point's very well taken.
Great, thanks. I'll just check if we have the audio of Rob.
Okay. And thank you for that. Sorry for the technical problems. Not sure what's going on today. So I'll just share briefly some of the lessons learned from our experience developing and implementing Risk Appetite and World Vision International. So we completed and began implementing our Risk Appetite Statement in 2018. For us, having an appetite statement has been very valuable in a lot of different ways. I think one of the big ones is aligning decision-making across the organization, guiding decision-making across large groups of managers, and in particular the cost-benefit analysis aspect of risk treatment and risk mitigation, where knowing what our appetite is will inform how much we're willing to spend or invest in treating that risk. And I think it also creates a lot of efficiency as well, because we don't have to have managers across the organization, trying to figure out what their appetite should be for different decisions or processes or projects they want to take on. It's all sort of spelled out, it's easily accessible, and we're not answering the same question over and over again. And of course, as this clever graphic points out, not having a risk appetite statement is sort of akin to building a bridge where you don't know how far it has to go to cross the river. So just at a very basic level, it's been very valuable to know, what when it comes to treating a certain risk or making a go, no-go decision, what's the level of risk that we need to reach, to be acceptable for the organization. So, some of the challenges that we encountered in developing our risk appetite statement, and there were many, but I've just picked here a few the sort of more significant ones. The first was identifying which risk areas to focus on. So, as you embark on that process of trying to establish, an appetite statement and different tolerance levels, the first question is, which types of risk do we want to specifically articulate tolerance levels for? I think, and that can be quite a difficult process because you have to get some general understanding and consensus across your stakeholders as to which are the key risks that need to be called out in a statement versus, what are more of our tactical, day-to-day operational risks that, don't need to be specifically articulated as a tolerance item. Once you've done that, then determining the right level of detail is the next challenge. the way I thought about this was, if you go too high level with your statement, which I've seen many risk appetite statements that are very summarized, I'll say, you kind of run the risk of that statement not having a lot of practical value and perhaps not being useful to the organization. And I liked your illustration, Oscar, of the golden spanner. I thought that was a great analogy for what happens in that scenario. On the other hand, if you go to too high of a level of detail, it becomes very difficult to apply that statement to the broad array of offices and operating contexts that you have. And that leads to a whole other set of debates and challenges. The third one, of course, is getting consensus. So, if you have a very large senior leadership team, a very large board, a lot of other stakeholders, as we do in our organization, coming to agreement on what the statement should say, what the different key risks are, and then what our tolerance levels should be, you can imagine there's a lot of different opinions and perspectives. And so for us, this required several months of negotiations, conversations, back and forth edits, approval processes, reapproval processes, that sort of thing. So it was quite an investment in time and effort to get this done and get it done right. Updating the appetite statement. Similarly, after you've gone through, say you spend a year doing all of that to develop your appetite statement, then you say a year from now we'll come back and update it. Well, are you signing up for that same process all over again? To some extent, yes, I would say. But I still think it's worth doing. We're in the process now of updating ours. I wouldn't say it's quite as challenging or time-consuming as the first time around, but a lot of the same conversations and negotiations still need to happen. And I think, by the way, there's a lot of value in that. I'm just saying from an effort standpoint, it's not a small one. So then lastly, operationalizing the statement and staying relevant. After you've completed your risk appetite statement, the question then becomes, how do we put this forth in the business? How do we make this real so that actual managers are making decisions in accordance with that appetite statement? Are we developing our strategy in line with our risk appetite statement? Are we going to change our risk appetite statement when our strategy changes? These are all questions that need to be answered as you go through this process. That's all right. And so out of that, I would say there's a few key, things we learned that helped us be successful, and I imagine will be helpful for others as well. The first, and Oscar touched on this as well, we want to be realistic and design the statement to fit the current ERM capability or maturity. I think the realistic part is important because there's always a temptation to be aspirational. I think we'd all have to say that we have zero tolerance or zero appetite for fraud, when in reality many of our operations and projects are in areas that do experience fraud, and maybe there is some incidence of that. I think your appetite statement should, as much as possible, align to reality. So you don't want it to be too high, to be more than what you are actually comfortable with, but not so aspirational, again, that it's sort of meaningless in the day-to-day decision making. It must be clear and specific enough to use for that decision making. It won't be perfect the first time. So accepting some level of imperfection or calling it a first draft or whatever you have to do, I think is a good strategy. I think there's a number of people that I said, this is just the first version. We'll update this on an annual basis, and we'll come back to this issue the next time around. Maybe we do need to add a new risk area, and maybe this one can drop off. Keeping in mind and always positioning it as a living document is a great way to overcome obstacles and push the process forward in a meaningful way and to finish. And then strong communications and change management are critical. We probably, I think, when we distributed our statement, we had an entire toolkit to accompany it. So pages and pages of what is a risk appetite statement? How was this one developed? How should you use it? What are some example scenarios within your office? How does this play into the risk register and the risk assessment process? And what if you want to change the risk appetite statement? Who can you talk to? What are your constraints? All of those questions have to be answered and understood across your offices for it to be a good, effective statement. And that does require some investment in those communications and change management. And last, but certainly not least, I think depending on how your organization is set up, you need a strong network of local risk managers or local focal points, or even just a strong internal team if you're a smaller organization, to help embed and support this statement with management on an ongoing basis. So for organizations maybe that haven't implemented a risk appetite statement yet, I would say, just plan on supporting that on an ongoing basis year after year. Questions will come up, issues will come in. It's very rarely, or at least it hasn't been in my experience, that you issue the appetite statement, train everyone, roll it out, and then go work on another project and set it to the side. It's always there with you, and I think that's the right way for it to function, but I think it's good to just allocate the resources intelligently. So that concludes my initial thoughts, but looking forward to the Q&A section. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Rob. Indeed, we have a lot of questions still coming in. A number of them are very specific to what you've been discussing. So I think we can address a couple of questions now before we move to the next theme. So first of all, from Heather in the UK, she writes, Rob, have you developed one overarching risk appetite statement, or do you have specific ones for particular areas, security, finance, counterterrorism, safeguarding, etc.? Over to you, Rob.
Yeah, that's a great question. Ours is structured in that we have, one overarching risk appetite statement that's largely narrative, and then we have a second section where we define what we call risk limits. I think it's just another term for the word risk tolerance, and that's where we spell out our specific tolerance for each of the different areas, so security, fraud, staff safety, all of those issues. And then beyond that, we allow individual offices and actually encourage them to what we call contextualize the appetite statement to their office. So they may add in additional areas that are more relevant to them, but might not be relevant to the whole organization. And the only constraint we provide them with is, keep to the same format and don't take a higher level of appetite than the overall organizational one. So don't exceed what the leadership has already said is the highest level of appetite tolerance that we have for a specific area.
Okay, great. There's just a quick follow-up on that. It's a good question, straightforward one from Robert, asking simply, can you give an example of a risk appetite statement? Practically speaking, what are we talking about here?
That's a good question. An example of a risk appetite statement. Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to think. The whole document is actually several pages long. Do you mean just a specific topic or a risk area within that appetite statement?
Yeah, I guess even just saying that it's several pages long, I think helps us to visualize. It's simply to visualize. Yeah, what does it mean practically to have a risk appetite statement? Is that like a mission statement, or is it a short paper? Yeah.
Yeah. No, I can describe it a bit more. So, as I mentioned, it opens with maybe a half-page narrative, that reads more like a mission statement, where, this is what World Vision's committed to best-in-class risk management. As part of that, we need to have a risk appetite statement that articulates our position, blah, 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 and sort of that kind of language that you might see in a policy. And then it says, as the risks defined below, it's, you must manage your operations and make decisions within the established risk areas. And then we'll have a section that looks more like, several rows, like a grid. We have a scale, 4-point scale. I think the lowest is minimal or risk averse. I think the top one is calculated risk, or risk taking perhaps is the category. And then on that scale, we place different risk areas, fairly broadly, maybe a paragraph each. And within that paragraph, for example, if we're talking about staff safety, we would say, World Vision works in areas that have a high degree of insecurity. We understand that some risk to staff is necessary, but World Vision will do X, Y, and Z to limit risk to staff. We value our staff. Of course, we have all these mechanisms in place to prevent people from getting injured or helping them if they do, that kind of a thing. Now, I would say if I were going to take it further, and probably we will do this in our next update, we'll add in the concept, a fourth column perhaps, in that section that's around key risk indicators. And this is where you put in place specific quantitative data points, usually, to give you an idea for when you've actually exceeded a risk appetite level or a risk tolerance level within that statement. This is usually fairly difficult to do, which is why we didn't try it the first time out. But I think it's also very important for knowing and being able to clearly see when you've exceeded your tolerance level. So hopefully that helps give you a better picture of how we've set up our statement.
That's perfect. Thank you. And actually, I think you've, with that, now you've also addressed a couple of other questions that came in, again, about that question of quantifiability. So that's very helpful indeed. So the question from Philip that just came in asking, do you express limits and tolerance in quantifiable terms? I think well addressed now. So let us move on. I hope that we will have time for a few more questions at the end. But we do have a lot of them coming in. Keep the questions coming. Everything that we can't address live on the air today now, we're going to hopefully try to follow up with in writing after the event. So do keep the questions coming in, and we will try to address as many of them as we can before the end. So now that we've discussed the concepts of risk appetite and risk tolerance at some length, I'd like to turn to a related topic now, that's namely risk sharing between donors and partners. So back to Jeremy then, what do we mean by risk sharing in humanitarian response, and how does it relate to risk appetite and tolerance? Over to you.
Thanks, Inherit. Yeah, it's been quite an interesting conversation back and forth, both the presentations and the questions to listen in on. As you said already, I think some excellent questions to help frame the dialogue today and respond to afterwards as well. Part of what we wanted to introduce today is also this concept of risk sharing. And I think the initial discussion we've already had on appetite and tolerance are critical foundations to consider as we move towards this thinking about risk sharing. And I think we've, in a number of dialogues, certainly at the global level right now around humanitarian finance, grand bargain, etc., we've been hearing increasing reference to this term risk sharing and risk transfer, I think, related to that as well. So to do a couple of definitions here again on the screen, risk transfer, maybe before I get into these two, I'll just say that these are a little less clear definitions. These aren't quoted from ISO. These are maybe a little more organic definitions when it comes to how we think of risk transfer and risk sharing. So thinking of risk transfer is something that occurs naturally anytime you have a relationship between partners, certainly where you have a contractual relationship or a funding relationship. It is natural that you would have some transfer of risk between parties as funding flows through a chain of partners, etc. So anytime there's a contract signed, for example, usually there's an implied or explicit, in many cases, transfer of risk between those partners. So risk sharing then is maybe a little more of an open term. So if we have risk transfer, something that naturally occurs, not inherently good or bad, but it occurs. Risk sharing, then considering that stakeholders in the humanitarian sector both transfer risk, but then also retain some appropriate level of risk as well. So risk sharing being a scenario in which you have stakeholders in the humanitarian sector, so in the chain of funding, for example, are individually managing risk, retaining and managing risk as appropriate, transferring only what's necessary to other partners. And I think this image of risk sharing starts to build quite heavily on what we've been talking about around risk appetite and risk tolerance. So you'll see the statement there at the bottom, and this really could be framed as a hypothesis, I guess. It would be interesting to have some reaction both from the panelists and the participants today on this. So, hypothesis that effective risk sharing really can't be achieved if stakeholders do not understand their own willingness and ability to manage risk. So, in other words, if we find ourselves in a place where risk appetite, or an individual organizational level where risk appetite is not defined, our risk tolerances may be poorly defined or not well understood, in that scenario, it is going to be very, very difficult to have an effective discussion about how we share risk among stakeholders in the humanitarian sector in an equitable way. So really, I think a key foundation that we have a solid understanding of risk appetite and risk tolerance if we're going to move forward and have a good, solid discussion on how we move from just a scenario of risk transfer to a more thoughtful place of risk sharing, where risks are appropriately managed and retained and transferred as appropriate among partners. I think at this point too, this has come up a couple of times in the earlier discussion, but good to touch back briefly on this concept of zero tolerance risk. And this is something that we discussed a little bit early on in our risk management series when we initially presented some thinking about organizational culture and foundational issues of risk. So this issue of risk, zero tolerance risk, I think frequently there's been increasing reference to zero tolerance language in a lot of contractual discussions around fraud, discussions around PSEA. I think in this earlier in our presentations today, we had some questioning back and forth on how we consider fraud. Is any level of fraud acceptable? So we have a lot of language floating around that suggests zero tolerance for incidents of fraud, corruption, mismanagement, etc. And the challenge with that language is that we can become overly focused on reducing incidents to zero without appropriately focusing on all of the background controls, risk management processes that need to be in place in order to appropriately manage those incidents when they inevitably do happen. Remember, we talked at the beginning that the humanitarian context in general is high risk. We don't expect there to be zero risk. So we're trying to focus this language around zero tolerance more on the concept that responsible risk management focus on zero tolerance for inaction, not reducing risks to zero. You could spend infinite resource trying to reduce risks down to zero, and it's not going to happen. So really the key factor is, are we having an appropriate zero tolerance for inaction as opposed to expecting some unrealistic scenario of zero risk? So hopefully that's clear enough. I think good to reintroduce that topic a little bit. I wanted to touch briefly in this area too on the question of localization, which is something that came up in the discussion chat quite early in the webinar today. I think particularly in this thinking around zero tolerance, there's implications on localization. One of the consequences we see of pushing risk down the humanitarian chain, or just straight transfer of risk without thinking about sharing, is that risk tends to be pushed increasingly towards local and national partners at the field who have some of the fewest resources available to actually manage risk well in some ways. So there's definitely a challenge there in terms of how we consider local and national partners. And if we flip too much into this mode of 100% transfer of risk down the chain of funding and thinking of zero tolerance in terms of incidents instead of inaction, there's some serious implications for our local national partners. Also on the localization side, though, I do think there are some significant opportunities for local and national partners when it comes to risk management. I think for myself, as you hear Oscar speak about the UNHCR experience, Rob speak about the World Vision experience, when you have a large, complex, multi-mandate, in some cases, certainly multi-context organization, the challenge of setting risk appetites, of implementing risk management processes can be likewise quite complex. In many ways, for local national partners that are largely working within a single context and have a much more simple line of management, organization of operations, it also in some ways can be more simple to introduce some concepts of risk management. Even if the risks involved are higher for a local and national partner, implementing certain aspects of risk management itself might in fact be easier. So I think something to consider in the localization question. There's an opportunity there, I think, a significant opportunity for local and national partners. That does also bring up a resourcing question. I think this is where really we're trying to work out some ongoing challenges. How do you get appropriate resources in place to do risk management well, to go through some of the steps of setting risk appetite tolerance? I think clearly some capacity questions or just basic learning questions that can be resolved, need to be resolved further at the local, national level. We've had some discussion in the past with donors indicating that, in fact, a lot of donors are more willing to include funding for things like good risk management than people are aware. And so anytime we're in a contract negotiation, and this would be true, I think, for all sizes of NGO partners, we have an indication that donors are more willing than we think sometimes to include resources for risk management in our contractual agreements, funding agreements. So it's important to ask for that as part of funding arrangements. So there's some opportunities there, but I think overall a clear area we need to work out more is how to get greater access for local and national partners to the resources available, resources necessary, I should say, to do good risk management. At the same time, I think a good opportunity there as well. And then just quickly, before I turn it back for some additional Q&A or comments, a couple of areas of current action. I mentioned the Grand Bargain earlier. Grand Bargain is ongoing. We won't have a long discussion on what that is today. In the past, there was not a strong discussion within the Grand Bargain around this concept of risk sharing, setting risk appetites, tolerance, etc. That's been an increasing piece of the discussion in the Grand Bargain. This idea that if we want to move towards risk sharing, that's a keyly or critically linked to the concept of improved trust between donors, agencies, and NGOs. And that's one way in which we're going to achieve better efficiency and effectiveness in the system, which is also the core target of the Grand Bargain. So work is currently underway, led by Netherlands and ICRC within the Grand Bargain framework to try and have a better focus on concepts of risk sharing in particular between now and the next Grand Bargain annual meeting in the summer of 2021. And then also just to note that this has been a key focus for ICVA, Interaction, other NGO fora. I mentioned the ICVA work on risk management early on. Interaction has also done some critical work around concepts of defining risk and risk transfer in particular between NGO partners. So there's some ongoing discussion as well as how these aspects of risk fit into donor contracts, particularly UN contracts, and how we can move forward to a more equitable sharing of risk. So a few points of action to highlight as well.
Okay, excellent. Thanks so much, Jeremy. I have to say, I wish we had another hour on this. There's so much more to discuss. We're going to try to squeeze in. I have two questions that follow on what you've been saying, Jeremy, and I'd like to turn to Rob and Oscar, and I'll pose these two questions at once, and then each of you, Rob and Oscar, come in with whatever reflections you'd like to share on these. So first, and again, this is following from Jeremy's most recent comments, Winone in the UK is wondering how risk risk tolerance and appetite are applied by international organizations when working with local partners, and how to appropriately apply risk sharing without damaging donor or compliance requirements, and really wondering how this question is being approached in your respective organizations. So that's one. I know very difficult to be brief on that, but any key points you'd like to share? And then the other question related is from Julian, connecting from Cyprus, who writes, do you find that there is a challenge in documenting the local risk management techniques of local partners, as often they can be relational or non-document based? So let's first go to Rob for your reflections on that, and then we'll turn to Oscar after. Over to you, Rob.
Yeah, sure. It's a good question. And I'll say I'm not the expert on this yet. It's still something we're working through internally. We have developed some, guidelines for assessing partner risk and protocols and things like that. But generally, I'd say we approach it, almost putting ourselves in the shoes of a donor with the partner organization, and that we evaluate their ability to manage risk, their capabilities. There's questions asked around, what measures do you have in place to prevent fraud with goods that, we're accountable for, things like that. And then we may take further steps to share risk, for example, by saying, if there is a loss, for example, in the food transport or distribution, maybe we split the liability on that, as opposed to World Vision retaining all the risk, and just outsourcing the work or the project to, another partner organization. So it is very difficult, though, and there's still plenty of examples where it's not done well. I think that's about the most I would say on that at this point.
Okay, thanks so much. And turning to Oscar, you have the floor.
Thanks. Those are two good questions. And actually, one of our strategic risks, so we have a separate risk register for our organization-wide strategic risks, of which there's 17. One of them is the risk of how we strike this balance between trust and accountability with our international and local NGO partners. And it's a challenge, and I think it's fair to say in UNHCR that the pendulum swung a couple of times. We were perhaps historically very much on the trust side, and then we maybe swung a bit too much to the accountability side, to the point where I think a number of NGOs felt that we were their worst donor. And now we're trying to calibrate that again to get it more in the middle. I think I saw some comments in the chat, and Jeremy was mentioning about funding NGOs. We used to always pay international NGOs an overhead support cost for management and risk management and other things like that. And we've now extended that to national NGOs. And so that's a proportion of the budget which is just given to them. There's no monitoring of it, but there's an expectation that it's invested in strengthening things like risk management, or if it's a very small NGO, back office controls, accounting, and so on. And maybe another point to add there is that we're increasingly trying to improve our risk-based approach to engaging with partners. So when we're working with a local NGO, for us to have a better understanding of what their strengths are, what their weaknesses are, and to tailor the monitoring and the capacity building around those. And one final point on this question, which is that another thing that we're trying to work towards now is to get more clarity on what zero tolerance actually means in reality, both when we act as a donor and when we act as a recipient. So, if you say, well, I have, zero tolerance for inaction on fraud, does that mean, if someone writes an anonymous note in a complaints box that says these people are all thieves, what response is needed? Or is no response needed? So we need to, be a bit more, clear and precise about what we mean with these concepts, and we're working to try and integrate that into our partnership agreements so that all parties are clear on what the minimum expectations are, and what the minimum response needs to be when certain different types of things happen. On to the last question about documenting the techniques for risk management in local partners. I think that's linked to this effort that we have to be a bit more sophisticated in our risk-based approach to partners. We do these very detailed assessments of internal controls that need to be expanded a bit to include risk management. And the only other thing I would say is that risk management processes should be proportionate to the organization. So, we don't want to go and dictate to a very small local NGO that they now, introduce a complex enterprise-wide risk management framework. But so I think, it's in some contexts, it might be satisfactory just to have a risk register for this particular project that's, maybe 10 risks, 15 risks, how many it is, and that we monitor and track over time.
Great. Thanks a lot, Oscar. We're going to steal a couple more minutes, and I want to pose one last question first to Rob and then to Oscar. And both of you, please do combine your response with any final remarks that you'd like to share with the group before we close out today. And then we'll go finally to Jeremy for his final remarks. So the question is coming in from Andy, and it is as follows. Do you see a fundamental imbalance in donor structures with the program management, quote, tail wagging the humanitarian advisor dog? It would seem that delivery practitioners are more flexible and understanding of delivery risk than those managing and negotiating program budgets and outputs. So first to Rob on this, then to Oscar. Over to you, Rob.
Yeah, I think there is some of that to an extent, and certainly on the recipient side, you want to, win the award or win the grant, and so I think that I don't necessarily know if that weakens one's position in that relationship, but I think it can, but I don't think it needs to, and I think these types of conversations go far in addressing that dynamic, because ultimately we have a shared goal to effectively manage risk and deliver, quality outcomes with our programs. So I think it's just I think probably what we need is just, as Jeremy talked a lot about earlier, more of a shared understanding of how we talk about risk, how we share risk, how we align risk. What do we need to be open about? If we do need more overhead to strengthen capacity and risk and compliance capabilities on the recipient end, then that should be a funding item that's discussed openly, whether that come in the form of additional insurance coverages or even direct assistance in some cases from donor organizations. I think that will significantly help that relationship. So and just closing comments, just to say this has been a really excellent conversation. I'm sorry we won't be able to get to all the very good questions we're seeing coming through in the chat box, but I'm happy to answer questions after the fact. I noticed quite a few on the topic of black swans, on zero tolerance. I think there's a lot more to discuss there, but certainly thank you for the forum today and everybody for presenting.
Thanks so much, Rob, and that's great to hear that you'll be happy to help answer some of those questions. As you say, there are some really great ones coming through, so we'll have to keep the discussion rolling. Thanks again for joining us. And now over to you, Oscar.
Thanks. So what do I want to say here? Maybe a first point in sort of the closing remarks is just to highlight, I shared a couple of links in the chat to pretty useful risk appetite statements, so one from USAID and one from Global Fund, which are publicly available. And also I would encourage all of you to try and, if you're interested in finding out more, to look at the UN High-Level Committee on Management guidance on risk appetite statements, which is a very useful document. although I'm biased as I wrote it, but hopefully you'll find it useful. To answer the question, I would say it varies. It varies from donor to donor, and sometimes within the same donor, it varies from country operation to country operation. And I think myself and my colleagues have been involved in very different kinds of conversations with different donors. And the thing I would add is that if, as the humanitarian community, and ourselves as implementers and donors, if we want to move away from the tail wagging the dog and to a more balanced approach, I personally think the best way to do it is through having these shared discussions with donors around risk appetite. I think the thing that unites donors is that they hate surprises. They hate getting calls from their capitals to say, we read about this scandal in the paper, what the hell is going on? So the more we're able to be very clear with the donors what controls we have in place, what risks we are facing, what risks remain, and what are the risks of not doing certain things as well, which is always important to bear in mind. And the more that we're able to be clear with them under what circumstances they will be notified about what, I think that's how we move forward in that conversation. If they have assurances that when things do go wrong, they will find out and not read it in the newspaper, and that they will be told, this is what we did to try and stop it from happening. It still happened, and this is what we're doing to respond to it. That's when they are happy, happiest in my experience. So yes, it varies. It can be a problem, but I think we have, as a humanitarian community, we have scope to improve that behavior through having these conversations and, demonstrating to donors that they can actually trust us.
Great. Thanks so much, Oscar. And thanks to you for being with us. Great to have your perspective on the issue and your experience, and hope that you also might have the time and willingness to help us a bit afterwards with follow up on some of the additional great questions that came in.
Sure. Very glad.
Terrific. So Jeremy, let me hand it over to you for any points that you'd like to share as a kind of wrap up from your side. You have the floor.
Sure, I can be brief. I'm appreciative for people staying on for this great discussion. I think part of our intent in carrying out this series is to learn ourselves from the discussion, from the comments coming back. And this installment in the webinar series on risk was no exception. I think something that what we're doing a little differently with this particular webinar, in many cases we have a pre-existing briefing or a paper that we're presenting and then have a webinar on. We're doing a little bit the opposite this time. So we started with this conversation to help us get a better sense of where we might focus some attention in terms of follow-up, briefing, etc., on risk appetite and risk tolerance. And I think we've had really quite an excellent discussion today, quite an excellent set of questions that I think have really been top in terms of some of the inputs we've had in general across the entire series. So we'll end today with a very good basis to do some follow-up briefing work and try and answer as many questions as we can. I think the questions have been very helpful in framing where we can provide some good follow-up input on these questions of risk appetite, tolerance, and how we move forward towards risk sharing. So highly appreciative on my end for both the presenters, Oscar and Robert, and their perspectives, as well as the conversation and particularly the Q&A too, that I think will help us answer a lot of good questions on these topics.
Great. Thanks a lot, Jeremy. It's really been a pleasure. We look forward to next time. Just to wrap things up then with a few housekeeping points for all of you. There will be, as mentioned, a recording of today's event, both in video and audio only podcast format that will be available on the event page in the coming days. And while you wait for the next session in the learning stream on risk management in practice, there are some other events in the coming days on related topics that might be of interest to you. You can join us, if you like, tomorrow, the 9th of September, when we will be looking at camp management, and in particular at the role of the new camp management standards for addressing practical challenges for coordination and implementation. Also next week, on the 15th of September, we'll be looking at the implications of COVID-19 for crisis financing. And our next event together with ICVA will be on how to implement the new EASC guidelines on inclusion of persons with disabilities in humanitarian response in the COVID-19 response. I hope you'll all consider joining us for one or more of those other upcoming events. Also, as mentioned, we will follow up with our speakers who've kindly offered to help us out to see if they can answer some of the questions that we didn't have time to address live today. We'll be posting those in the PHAP community where you can all continue the discussion until the next event. So with that, a huge thanks to our panel, to ICVA, to my co-host Jeremy, to all of our colleagues behind the scenes for making this possible, and most importantly to all of today's participants for a very interesting discussion. Looking forward to next time. This is Ann Lang signing off from Geneva.